Hello. Today we're going to talk about objects in PHP. So before I get started with this, I'm going to mention that this is going to be one of the more difficult lectures that I've ever had to give. It's difficult to think that we can even attempt to cover objects, object-oriented programming in a single short lecture, but that's what I'm planning to do here today. You're not going to leave this being an expert, and you're probably going to have more questions than answers that I'm going to give you about the subject. This is just intended to provide an introduction to the subject, familiarize you with the vocabulary, and some of the absolute basics that I think you should know. Where this leads is to PDO, which is an object-oriented model of interfacing with a database, and that's something we'll be using next week. In regards to this lecture, these are the things that I'm hoping that you're going to leave today with a reasonable understanding of. I think it's important to note that what we're talking about is all theoretical. It doesn't make a lot of sense until we see examples. And we will see examples. The examples are all at the end of this. Now I go back and forth on how do I make this doable. All my examples are at the end. I'm going to blow through the speaking part of this presentation as fast as I can, which isn't going to be that fast. I'm going to try and get you just establish some kind of a context and introduce some vocabulary. And then when you see it in play, I think it's going to be a lot better. And there's also a lab this week. And so there's not even an assignment. I'm not expecting you to have ownership of this material. I'm just expecting you to be able to maybe fake it. Right? Like have some familiarity with the terms that you need to know and be able to complete some things with some guidance. So, I've got examples of all of these things. So we're going to talk about defining classes, and along with that, we'll talk about methods and properties. That sounds scarier than it is. Instantiation. This is a keyword, calling methods, magic methods, and inheritance. Those are our goals for today. So first off, what is an object? Like I said, I'm going to be doing a lot of talking in the beginning. An object is a programming structure where all the related variables and functions are grouped together. This is a constructed object-oriented programming, and I've got a slide in that in a few minutes here. Objects are created by defining classes. So we're going to learn how to create classes, and those classes have methods and properties. This is where we're talking about vocabulary right now. Method is just another word for function. If the function belongs to a class, we call it a method. Properties, these are variables that belong to a class. So the interesting thing here is this sounds like a bunch of new terminology, and it kind of is, but it's also kind of stuff that you already know. So when you create an object, what that really means is define a class, and when you have a class, you create instances of that object, and it's called instantiation. That's a big fancy word. You see those objectives? We just did 3 of them, kind of. All right, so we're talking about user-defined classes right now. There's also predefined classes that already exist in PHP. You use them, even though you don't think about them. So there's these 2 functions, and I don't think that you should care about them at all. I'm just going to use them for my demonstration right now. There's a function called getDeclaredClasses, and it returns an array. There's also class exists, which will tell you if something does exist. So here's my example of that. Here's that function called getDeclaredClasses. It doesn't do anything. That returns an array, if you didn't notice what I said on my slide. I'm just doing silly things right now, just to kind of get you started. I'm going to attempt to echo this out so you can see all the declared classes that exist. This isn't going to go very well. We get the good old array to string conversion. So that thing that you get from calling that function is an array, which my documentation said. So you can't echo out an array, but what you can do is you can print R it. And I'm doing this now, but I don't think you're ever going to do this. This is not a very useful tool, but it'll help you understand that we're talking about classes as this abstract idea. PHP has a bunch of classes built into it already. There are 141 of them, actually. Right? The first one's std class, and then the last one's var file info. Notice there's also one called animal. That is a class that I created. Now, just another tip. I showed it to you last week. I might as well show it to you again. If you don't like the way that looks, Sorry, I'm already changing my mind. I'm going to echo these out. I was going to not echo them because they are just pure HTML. But then I remembered that the bottom of my file is way down the page. So we'll do this. And this will show you what those look like. Not that you care, right? Did I just waste 2 minutes of your time? Maybe. But this is a bit, I just wanted to show you that how those pre-tags work again and the idea of a print R when you want to display an array. So notice those are all the classes that you have by default. You can import more classes, create your own classes. All right, so we're talking about defining classes, but classes exist already. So classes and objects. This is related to object-oriented programming. People oftentimes abbreviate it as OOP. So there are several benefits to object-oriented programming. Before I get started with those, it's interesting enough to go to Google and then write something. So for your search term, just do something derogatory about object-oriented programming, and you will find a ton of stuff. There's a lot of people that are knowledgeable, experts, that do not like object-oriented programming. Overwhelmingly, people do like object-oriented programming, and whether you like it or not, you should know that it exists. And I'm going to try and teach you just the basics of the vocabulary and how to use it today. It is difficult to understand the idea of object-oriented programming and its benefits. I'm just going to do the really quick, like a 10-mile-away explanation here. So generally speaking, these 4 things are hailed as benefits of object-oriented programming. One is encapsulation. That's the idea. I mean, when back on a previous slide, when I said what is an object, I was kind of describing encapsulation. That's the idea that you've got all the related code together in one module. Encapsulation is oftentimes called modularity. It's taking the related pieces of code and putting them together in their own modules. So let's say you've got a big program and you're having some problems with the cat class. Well, it's nice to have a cat class because then you know the problems are contained in that cat class, I guess. I'm doing pretty mediocre examples here. Abstraction. Abstraction means in this context the same it does in any other. This is the idea of being more concerned about what something does than how it does it. So rather than getting wrapped around the axle in how you're going to do something or how something works, which needs to be dealt with at some time, just being more concerned with what can this thing do, how can you describe this thing generally speaking. Polymorphism. This is the idea that one object can have many forms. That is what polymorphism means. An example of polymorphism would be, let's say we have a class called shape, and one of the things that a class can do is calculate its area. So depending on whether that shape is of a type triangle or rectangle, it's going to have a different functionalities. That's a decent example of polymorphism. Inheritance, that's the one thing that I really can explicitly demonstrate today. It's going to be woefully short, but this is the idea of reusing code in derivative classes. So this is going to be nothing to you at this point, but let's say we have an animal class, and we put a bunch of time into creating this animal class. And then we have a zebra class that is a child of that animal class. And so when we were writing that zebra class, we wouldn't have to rewrite all the stuff we already wrote for animal. Inheritance is actually the easiest to understand, I think, because it works like it works in reality. All right, so at this point, we're about 9 minutes in, and you're probably sitting there saying, what in the heck are we talking about? Well, it's about to get a little bit better. That was the pure theory stuff. Now we're going to start getting into the details. As I said, the examples come later, and there's a lab that we're going to do this week. So you're going to get a fair amount of good looks at what this is going to look like, and that's going to help more than all the talk, so I'm trying to get the talk out of the way. All right. User-defined classes. So if we want to create classes, it's keyword class. You probably could have guessed that. From classes, we create objects. So objects are instances of classes, I guess, something like that. So objects are made up of methods and properties. Methods is a fancy word for functions. Properties is a fancy word for variables. So if these things belong to a class definition, we refer to them as such, even though it's not really much more complicated than that. All right. The next on our tour is access modifiers. Now, these are probably something you might have no experience with. And I think they're fairly intuitive. You got to see them in play to appreciate them. So public means that something can be accessed from anywhere. And when I say something, I mean a method or a property. Public is the easiest to work with. You can access it from outside the class. Private means it can only be accessed from inside of the class itself. So if you're defining a property of a class, you are not allowed to reference it outside the class if it's private. And protected means that the methods or properties can only be referenced by children or classes that extend or are derived from a parent class. That was a host of the right words I just said. I know it doesn't mean anything. But in that animal zebra example, like a zebra would be a class derived from animal, which would be like higher up in the hierarchy. All right, so those are your access modifiers, public, private, and protected. Protected is only relevant when we're talking about inheritance, which we're largely not this week. Class variables, also known as properties or attributes. These must be declared with an access modifier. So that's the only difference here. We declare these just like any other variable, but we have to put an access modifier in front of it. And I don't really want to explain those again, but that is how those work. Here's an example. So if you wanted a variable called fname, you just need to put an access modifier in front of it. Public fname, that's going to be accessible anywhere. Protected SSN, that means that's only going to be accessible by a child class. Private would mean it's only accessible within that class. Like I said, I'm just trying to give you basic fluency so you can follow along with my examples. I would love to do more examples, but like I said, I'm going to put those in the back of this thing. And I've thought quite a bit about just having the lecture and the example be separate things because I think the example is going to be so much more valuable than this lecture. But I am also thinking that going straight to the example without seeing the lecture is going to be pretty close to meaningless. It's okay if your head is spinning right now and you're wondering what in the heck I'm talking about because you're going to see some examples soon enough. That said, here's an example. It's a terrible one. It's worthless, but here you go. So if I wanted to create a class called city, it's keyword class. City's up to me. Set of curly braces indicating the scope of the class. Here's a property called zip. It's public. Here's a property called state. It's public. Here's a property called state secret code, and it's private. Definitely not rocket science. You will run into issues if you forget to put those class modifiers in, those access modifiers when you're creating a class. So it seems straightforward, and it is, but you're probably going to forget to do it sometimes. But it's okay. You'll figure it out real quick. All right, naming classes. So classes are just creating a class in PHP. This is all convention. You don't have to do anything. I mean, this is the syntax for creating a class, but in terms of how you should organize your files, a convention is, generally speaking, we call our class, we capitalize our class names. But notice this right here. So PHP file extension, of course, it's a PHP file. If you start the names of all your classes with class, then when you list them alphabetically, which is probably how you list things, then all your class files will be together. So that's just a smart trick. XXX being the name of it. So if this was a cat class, it'd be class.cat.php. These are just conventions. I probably can't even hold you accountable for conventions, really. I'm just telling you this is oftentimes how it's done. Instantiation is a big fancy word, which means creating an instance of. So if you created a class robot and you wanted to create an instance of robot, that's called instantiation. And if you want to create an instance of an object, you got to use this new operator. You've probably seen this before. You've probably written it before. You probably just didn't think a whole lot about it. But when you create an instance of an object, use new. I've never taught a programming class where we didn't use the new operator, even though I didn't explain what it was doing. New, so you'd be like new cat Garfield, something like that. So new means I want to create an instance of an object. And what that really means is you're calling constructor. Don't worry about that. I'll show you what a constructor is soon enough. Constructor is the fancy method that you use. Well, it's not really fancy. It's the necessary method that you need to set up an object. We can certainly have multiple instances of an object. If you didn't have multiple instances of an object, you shouldn't have used an object. Object-oriented programming is kind of analogous to functions in that it's like if you're going to do something more than once, you might be better off giving it a name and making it reusable. So, big word, not too hard to do, you'll see. So referencing class variables. So this is where things get a little bit weird. So let's say you create an instance of a class and you want to reference like the name of that cat or the weight of that cat or use one of its methods. You got to use this arrow operator right here. So that thing. Right, it's a hyphen and an arrow, a right arrow. Now, I'm pointing out this right here because last week we were talking about arrays and for each loops. And if you recall, when you're talking about associative arrays and for each loops, that operator is in play. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about this one today. So when you're talking about objects, classes, instances, it's that arrow operator right there. I don't even know if I should point at that. I just feel like I should because you just messed around with it last week. Another thing about when you're referencing properties or methods of an object, there's no $sign, so it looks like this. So this right here, this is instantiation that I was talking about a minute ago. This is a variable called student, and so when I assign it a value, I use that new operator, and then so this is saying student is an instance of the class student. Whenever you see new, that means you are creating an instance of a class, and that is the class. So student is an object of type student. I always do that kind of stuff. You know, it's not until I say it out loud that I'm like, oh, why do I call things the same? I don't know, but I did. So if you wanted to, so we're assuming that a student object has a attribute called GPA. If you wanted to print out the GPA of that student, you would use that operator right there. And so when I say there's no $sign, I mean no $sign there. So we don't need to specify that that is a variable because this right here is kind of sort of indicating that this is a variable. It's an object, but it's a variable. And then we're referencing a property of the object right there. So arrow operator. Methods. So far we've talked about properties a lot. If you've got a function which is part of a class, then we use the term method for that. And the keyword is still function, even though we reference it as a method. If you find that to be a little confusing, well, there's no way it isn't. So hopefully you're hanging in there. Now we're getting close to the point where we're going to do a cool example. So if you've made it through this 20 minutes of me just giving you, like I said, vocabulary and very high-level discussion of some of the things that I think you should know, if these words, if you've heard them and you could recite half of them to me, you're probably doing all right. All right, so a specific kind of method is called getters and setters. So here's examples of getters and setters. So like let's say we had some, I don't know, person or something. So like set age, get age, right? I mean, you see why they're called getters and setters. That sets age, that gets age, set name, get name. These are very common functions. They might seem maybe like they wouldn't be common. I'm telling you, they're super common. When you start creating objects, you end up having to create functions for setting and getting, like all the properties of that function. In my first programming job, I wrote a lot of getters and setters. And oftentimes they're just one-liners. But they are common enough that they are called getters and setters. If you want to call a method, you call a method similar to how you would reference a property. So it's that arrow operator. So here's that student again. Student equals new student. Now this would be me calling a method, which is a member of the student class called display name. Right, so whether I'm calling a method or referencing a property, it doesn't matter. It's that same operator. This is just indicating that this thing belongs to that thing. And there could be scope implications based on those access modifiers. All right, now The funny part about this is I can't use the word this without like 50 times here. So I'm talking about this with a $sign in front of it. So keyword this. This is used to reference the object from within the definition of the object. Now, there's like almost no way I can explain this, but when you see me do it, it'll make more sense. And when you do it, because you're going to practice this, it'll probably make a fair amount of sense. Talking about it is almost a waste of time, but I'm telling you it's actually super important. So you create an object with the intention of creating many instances of that object. When you are, and you refer to specific instances of the object like this, but when you are defining the class itself, you don't know what the name of the instance is, so you just refer to it as this. You will see. It's going to get better, I promise. Magic methods. So this is just, I just love this phrase. In PHP, the predefined methods in a standard class are referred to as magic methods. When you are defining a magic method, it is preceded by 2 underscores. So like if you go underscore toString, you are defining the toString method of an object. We are going to do toString. We are going to do construct. We're not going to do get and set. Get and set are generic functions used to get and set generic properties of an object. So they're called magic methods. They're kind of special in that they are, I guess the best way to explain it would be when you create an object, PHP is expecting that you are going to define these functions. I guess that's probably the best way to explain it. You don't have to define them. Like I'm not going to do get and set, but I'm going to do those. And the most important magic method is constructor probably. It's either it's probably constructor. ToString is really important too, as you'll see. We'll do both of those today. So constructors are the methods that an object uses to initialize an instance of itself. So if you want to create a constructor for a class, it's always going to be called underscore construct. And so you know when I said student equals new student, when you write new, what that really means is you're calling the constructor for the class. So when I say student equals new student, I'm really calling the constructor for student. That either helps or it doesn't help. Another magic method is destruct. This is used to remove an object from memory. I don't plan on doing that today. All right. So the things I said we were going to cover today. Because right now, if you're sweating a little bit and you got a little bit of panic, you're like, I don't think I understood anything he just said. Well, sorry, I'm trying my best. Actually, I really did work at this lecture for a while. So I said we were going to do defining classes. And when you talk about defining classes, you talk about methods and properties, and you talk about access modifiers. Instantiation, that's the business of creating a new object. This is a magic keyword that you're going to need. You're just going to have to see it. I showed you how to call methods and access properties, right? That was that arrow operator. Magic methods, constructor and toString, and inheritance. So I'm going to do an example right now where I show you everything up to that part. Maybe I get to that, maybe I don't. But we're almost done with this thing. So I am going to show you a functional example of a class, and I think this is going to help, and I'm going to try and illustrate all those things on it, and then we'll start moving forward. So if things aren't going well, I think they're probably going to start going better. So here's that file I had. I'm going to get rid of this stuff. All right. So what I did is I created a class called animal. All right, so keyword class, name of the class is animal. My curly braces go from here to here, indicating my scope. It's generally speaking a very good idea to comment out your closing curly brace on a class, because you're certainly going to have other sets of curly braces inside of that. All right, I might as well comment that out. So in looking at this thing right here, this object here, so it's right, I define it by creating a class. This class has 4 properties. One is category, one is type, one is name, one is ID. These right here are access modifiers. So category, type, and name are all public, meaning they can be referenced from outside of the class. Private can only be referenced from inside the class. So creating properties, easy as that. You just got to put a access modifier on them. This right here, this is a method. And at that, this is a magic method. Notice it's got the double underscores under it, so it's a constructor. So this is, the best way to explain this is when you create an instance of animal, right, you're going to have to use that keyword new. New is going to call this constructor right here. And this constructor takes 3 arguments. It takes category, type, and name. Now, I went all over the place trying to figure out the best way to do this. The problem is that like category is going to be something like mammal or bird or reptile. The problem is in the real world of biology, those are called classes. And I started out doing this example calling this class, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't like the way this is going. So that's what I mean. So by category, I mean like mammal or something like that. And also type, right? Type seems like a keyword too. It's in some way, I always like doing the animal examples because they're fun, and I don't know, I'm just interested in them. But the names of the stuff, it's pretty terrible for programming because it all means something else. All right, so here's one method. I could make more methods. I mean, I guess let's do another method. Public function. So I'm trying to do something abstract, something that any animal would do. Actually, I was gonna say like breathe, but I see, this is where things start getting weird. Let's go eat. Right, so now I just created another function. What does this thing do? I don't know. Let's say it says yum yum. There we go. It doesn't matter what it does. So I've got a class with 4 properties and 2 methods. That's not so hard, is it? I mean, it's weird to think that I spent 20 minutes talking about stuff that seemed pretty complicated, and then when it comes down to it, I guess that's it. All right, so that's defining a class. It's not very interesting until you test it. So I made a new thing down here. So here's what it looks like to create an instance of a class. So I've got this thing. I'm calling it Annie. Annie's the name of it, right? It looks like a variable. It is a variable. Normally when you create a variable, you think of those as being primitive types, like integers or floats or booleans. Strings are actually, they're native, but they're not primitive. Strings are actually objects because they can do things like they have lengths and 2 upper and 2 lower and UC words. So this is a variable, but its type is object instead of something simple. And so new means I'm going to create an instance of something called animal. And this set of parentheses right here, that is a reference to the constructor for the class animal. Notice I'm passing it 3 things, and this thing takes 3 things. So we're all good. This is not here exactly that I want to talk about it, but I do want to point out that the first thing is going to go get cast into that first category. That's going to be the second thing. That's going to be the third thing. Order matters a lot. All right, so now I've got this thing called Annie. It's an aardvark. If you want to print out stuff about Annie, I can say, hey, Annie, I want to... how about I'll call the eat function, or the method, right? So I created an animal called Annie, and I'm going to tell Annie to eat. And since it's public, I should be able to call it from outside of the function, or outside of the class definition. And let's see what an uninteresting example looks like. Yum yum. Are you impressed yet? You shouldn't be. All right, let's make that thing private. You could probably guess what's going to happen now. So now I'm attempting to access something with a private modifier from outside of the class. Let's see what this says. Call it a private method, eat. So as I said, I spent a lot of time talking, but I really had to kind of set the stage for this vocabulary and frame the discussion. But once you start looking at examples, it's not that bad, I don't think. What else could I do here to make things more interesting? Let's just do something weird, like make that protected. And let's say I want to reference that property. It's called name. As you could probably imagine, and that's not a function. Now I'm just referencing a property. You see I get kind of a similar error because it's not a derived class. But if I wanted to look at type is public, so I can access that no problem. Well, I would say that. And I get nothing. I didn't mean to make this mistake, but yeah, that's what happens if you don't echo something. And then you see how that works. So that's access modifiers, that's accessing properties, that's accessing methods, and that is calling a constructor. So this simple example here kind of covered a lot of what we're talking about. Now you might not feel like, you know, you've seen enough, or you're ready to create a bunch of classes on your own. That's okay. The assignment for the week is just a lab, meaning I'm going to give you the solution to it. I just want to give you some hands-on experience with this. All right, so I think that was about as far as I could go with this. Oh, I totally blew over this. So this was my chance to show you what the heck that means. You notice all these references right here to this? So this constructor here has one purpose, and that is to initialize the properties of an instance of an object. And so you'll see how I'm using it. It just means whoever called. So you have instances of objects. Annie is an instance of animal. And inside the class definition for animal, I can't refer to Annie because Annie doesn't exist within the scope of this class. Annie exists outside of this class. And so I use the keyword this to reference that. Really the best way to explain it is it's the calling member of this class. If I had another one called, let's see, what's a good aardvark name? I think Arlo is pretty good. You'll see, so here I'm setting Annie's properties. And here I'm setting Arlo's properties. And so this is just meant to reference whoever the calling, whatever instance of this object is calling this function. Gosh, I'm super tempted to do like getters and setters right now, but I understand that this video is already going to be too long, so I don't think I'm going to do it. You know, every time I say that, it means I end up doing it, so fine, let's do a public get type. Okay, so this is that actually looks like a predefined function when I write it like that. Let's do get name. And so this would do something like return this, right? Because I don't know who's calling it. This is a generalized function meant to do what it's supposed to do, which is get the name of whoever called it. And then, so I'll say, yeah, echo Annie get name. Now, this is just worse than writing Annie name because I had access to that, but this is an example of a getter. It gets something for you. And a setter would set something for you. All right, so I think we did everything up to there. Now, let's do I will do a toString just to make this some kind of a complete example here. So you notice that I'm creating them here, but when you create them, nothing really happens. And you see when I test them, I have to test their properties individually. Well, you could totally make a cool string out of this and say like, hello, my name is Annie, I'm an aardvark, and I'm a mammal, or something like that, and test out those properties. But toStrings are all about testing. So let's make a toString function. This is a magic method, meaning it's one of those things that is expected to be defined. So public function underscore underscore toString. And so a toString function, it's kind of interesting. A toString is, well, I'll show you what it is. It's pretty cool if you can appreciate this. So like, let's say I want to echo out Annie. I can't echo Annie because Annie's complex, right? Like you and I would think, oh, maybe you'd want to know Annie's name or type or something like that. But the fact is Annie has a lot of attributes, so that doesn't really work. kind of similar to the way that you can't echo out an array because they're complex and you don't actually know what part you want to reference. When you write the toString function, you are defining what happens when you print one of those things. So I'll say return big old string here. So my name is something. I am a something, and I don't even know how to write these things. I am a. You see, I am going down this path where I'm going to say I'm a something, but I don't know what to do about that. So in here, this is a good time to use this because it's whoever's calling it. This is going to be this name. I am a this type. I am a category. So that should work. So now when I run this, you see I get this, which is pretty cool. It's a good illustration of what a magic method is. So my name is Annie. I am an aardvark. I am a mammal. Right? It's a testing function. It's a glorified testing function. So when you write a toString function, you are defining basically what happens when you attempt to print out an object. Because as you can imagine, there would be some things you'd want to display and some things you wouldn't want to display, and there's some formatting that you'd want to do with that. So notice that this is a function which returns a string, and it's what you get when you call or when you try and print out Annie. So this is a good example of a magic method because it has a predefined meaning, and it's the thing that happens when you press print. Same with a constructor. It's a predefined function. It's the thing that happens when you create a new animal. You don't have to define these things, but you're probably going to end up defining them a lot of the time. So at this point, I think we're looking pretty good. I mean, so we went from, well, in my opinion at least, we went from just talking about some things that were pretty abstract to seeing some examples of them. And when you see examples of them, they're not so scary. It's still pretty scary. I mean, you're going to have some problems when you go to make one, but it's kind of how it works. So just here's the PowerPoint-ish example. So let's say I wanted to create an object called student. What properties might a student have? And so when it comes to creating an object, which is where we're at now, the first thing you should do is that abstraction. So think about what can this thing do and what properties does it possess. So design is what we're talking about right now. So if you've got a student, what properties might a student have? I'm thinking things properties a student might have might be name, address, date of birth, social security number. I don't know, right? You could go on and on and on. And if you think about that, some of those things are public, like directory information, like maybe an email address and a name. And some of those things are going to be private, like a social security number. So think about the attributes of a thing. And then what methods might it possess? So that means what are the things that a student might do? Well, a student might have methods like get age or set age on like every property could have a getter or a setter. A student might be able to do things like study or sleep, right? So there's the things that the attributes that it has, and then there's the things that it can do. There's also going to be things like constructors and toStrings, but those are kind of like we don't usually talk about those in the first phase of this because those are things that you're probably just going to define anyways. So when you're creating an object, you want to think about what it is and what it needs to be able to do. So here's a student, and let's just say that students have names and majors. So it's got two properties, both with public access modifiers, and it's got a constructor, and the constructor sets the name and the major. Right, so at this point, you should probably be getting your head wrapped around constructors a little bit because you got these classes or objects which are completely generalized, and it's the constructor which sets up the properties of the specific example or the instance of that object. So, referencing that student example, This would be an example of creating 3 instances of class student. So student A. When you say new student, that means you're calling the constructor for student, and I'm passing it Charlie and culinary, so that means the first one's name is going to be Charlie and major is going to be culinary. So you see 3 instances of object student, all with the same properties, but with different values for those properties. Testing a class, this is also something I talked about a little bit. Initially I was gonna, you can see the way this PowerPoint's structured, I was gonna loop back to that animal example at this point, but I kind of already talked about this. So in terms of that animal class, creating instances of a class is pretty easy. You're gonna use new, and then the name of the class, and then pass the constructor what it needs. And then when it comes to testing those classes, because that's the thing, is creating a class doesn't do anything that you can verify. You can do little print statements like I did in the beginning with echoing out the properties and calling some of the methods. ToString is very helpful, as you saw. ToString is a good way to test the properties, make sure they got initialized correctly. You've kind of seen that in play. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is inheritance. So the key word for inheritance is extends. When you see a class definition that uses the word, so like, class cat, it would say class cat extends mammal. The term or the phrase after the word extends is the name of the parent class. And when a class is extended from another class, it gets all of the protected and public stuff from that class. Now, I very much considered not doing anything with inheritance in this lecture today because we've covered the fundamentals of what you need to create a class. I just like to show inheritance because I've given lectures like this many times, and it usually kind of seems like I'm talking to a brick wall because it's such an abstract concept, kind of out of nowhere, right? And it's not really related to anything we've done before too much. It's when I show inheritance that people start to appreciate this a little bit. So I'm going to go back to my zoo or my animal example, and I'm going to do some inheritance on it. So let's say we got animals. Now, I don't know what an animal is, and I'm not trying to have that discussion. Is a bug an animal? Is a bird an animal? I don't know how that stuff fits together. But, mammal's kind of what I'm going after here. And since I'm calling mammal category, I'm going to wipe that out. You'll see what I'm doing in a minute here. I guess. Because I'm thinking you're going to have animals, and then you're going to have subclasses of animals, like reptiles and mammals and... I don't know, fish. I don't know, right? I don't know. So, I guess we'll get rid of that stuff. And I'm going to create a class which extends that class. So, in this example here, if you're going to use inheritance, this is where you can see some of the benefits of it, of the reusing code and writing less code. So there's certain things that animals all have, like a type, a name, and an ID. I'll go class mammal. I think mammal extends animal. So I'm telling you that when I'm writing this mammal class, all of this stuff is already there, except the ID. Let me do... I don't know what I want to do with that. But I just want to kind of show you how this works. So notice I created a class with nothing in it. Let's say I want to create a new... I'll go... it's a good... Ryan the Rhino. That sounds good. New... mammal. Oh gosh, is it... Yeah, here's where, like, I don't know if this is a mammal. I think it's a mammal. If a rhino is not a mammal, first of all, please don't make fun of me for not knowing. I'm just thinking it seems kind of like... has some horns and some tough skin. I imagine it's a mammal. If it's not, I don't really want to hear about it. But, yeah, go ahead in the comments if you want. So what I'm doing when I do new mammal, notice there's no constructor here. You can see this is the point where things got improvisational. There's no constructor. So I'm going to call a constructor, and I'm telling you it's going to default to that constructor because it inherits all the stuff from the parent class. Actually, so mammals only... or things only have 2 things here, I guess. So it's going to be a rhino, I guess. And its name is going to be Ryan, and then I'm going to echo Ryan down here. So this is a cool example because I am referencing the constructor and the toString from the parent class. So notice, like, if I had a whole bunch of different animals, they would, I could instead of having to write this code for every one of them, I now get to reuse it by doing this. Okay, that did not work because I got rid of the category. Remember when I changed things around? Because I'm thinking what I intended to mean by category was actually mammal, so I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm getting too bogged down in animal stuff. My name is Ryan, and I'm a rhino. All right, so that's an okay example of inheritance. So notice I get to access all of this stuff when I'm creating this. And so for mammals, the interesting thing about this is how this would work is you would want to think about stuff that's specific to mammals, but not really necessarily animals. So I do actually know a thing or two about mammals. Like one of the things they do is they give live birth. So one of their methods would be live birth or something. And another thing about mammals, I think they have hair. So like that would be an example of a property of a mammal, which wouldn't be applicable to all animals. So you see how the design works? That kind of like you generalize or abstract up here, and then as you get into more specific instances of animals, you have to get a little more specific. But there are certain things that all animals share, and that's an important part of inheritance and class design. Like I said, I did such a short demonstration on this that I'm not sure how much value you get out of it, but you at least get to kind of see what I'm talking about here. And so notice that creating these derivative classes is a lot easier if you do a smart job of designing your parent class. So let me loop back to those objectives today. So said we were going to talk about defining classes, so methods and properties, instantiation, which is creating an instance of a class. This is a keyword, which is confusing, but at this point I hope you understand what it's necessary for. Talked about calling methods, accessing properties, magic methods, specifically constructors and toString, and we briefly talked a little bit about inheritance. So I think those are that's the vocabulary you need to have some kind of a discussion about objects. And this week we are doing an object lab, which will give you a little bit of hands-on practice. It's pretty abstract stuff. I'm not going to keep beating you over the head with it throughout the course, so if you didn't really have a great grasp on this, it's not going to wreck you in this class. I just wanted to attempt to address it because it's going to come up at some point, and it'd be good if you could at least nod your head saying that you have some understanding of these concepts. That's all I was going for here today. So I hope you found this somewhat helpful. Thanks for watching.